So this is our stream site for Climbers Run. It's a 10-meter area, so you can see across the stream there are some flags. Delineates our 10-meter area. We do that because part of what we do is getting a flow rate, and by having 10 meters marked out gives us a way to get that flow rate down the line. So one of the first things that we do when we come streamside is to look around, because we want to say what the surrounding land area usage is like, because depending on the surrounding land usage, it can help to qualify the results that you might get. Because you would expect very different results from something running through a preserve like Climbers Run and something running past a golf course, for example. So if we got the results from a golf course from Climbers Run, that would be of a bigger concern. So if we got really high nitrates or phosphates from Climbers Run, it would be more concern than if we saw that from a golf course. So we still care about the nitrates at a golf course, but it makes more sense. So the first thing we do is surrounding land use. Here we have mostly forest and shrubs and small trees. Another thing we look at is the bottom of the stream. So the stream has all kinds of different sizes of rocks. So this is a nice rocky bottom stream, and you'll see that it varies everywhere from boulders, which are like 10 inches and bigger, down to fine sand and silt. What Climbers Run usually, you can see here, has mostly cobble, which is that 3-inch area. So why we look at that is because it allows us to quantify whether there would be good attachment sites for macroinvertebrates, which are the small larvae and insects that are the lower life forms for things like fish. And then the fish are for birds, so it's just the basis of the food web. So if we, again, this allows us to quantify results that we see. So if we did a macroinvertebrate survey and the rocky bottom is there, it looks nice and it's good attachment points for these macroinvertebrates, but we don't see the macroinvertebrates, that tells us that something happened and pollution might have come down and wiped them all out. So that would give us a reason to investigate further, because chemistry doesn't always tell the whole story, because you can get a chemical sample and your chemical bottle or your sample bottle is in the water for just a few seconds and you don't know what happened before or right after your sample was taken. So you can get really good chemistry, and if all you did was chemistry, you might not know there was a problem that occurred. So one of the first things that we do is take our sample. We try to take it at basically the same spot every time. So I'm just a little bit downstream of our upstream site, and you always just take your sample. You always want to rinse, because you don't want anything that happened since your last sample to contaminate this sample. And you also stand behind or away from where you're taking your sample, because just by walking you're going to disturb the bottom, and you don't want to get that in your sample. The other thing we do streamside is measure our dissolved oxygen. So this is a dissolved oxygen meter. And this sensor has a little gold disc at the bottom here, and that's a membrane that allows oxygen to pass over the membrane, and then the sensor reads that, and it also gives us a temperature. And then of course it has a protective housing, because I'm going to put it down and I don't want to knock it on any rocks. And so in a stream that's still, you would want to make sure that you give it movement, because some movement is required to get a good reading. But in a stream that's moving like this, you don't have to give it anything extra. And then you just go until it stabilizes. So dissolved oxygen is important because all of your higher life forms need oxygen to survive, just like we do. And if your dissolved oxygen is too low, you aren't going to have those very sensitive organisms in there. You aren't going to have your brook trout that like it cool and high oxygen, or your mayflies that need a decent amount of oxygen and they're sensitive to pollution or poor conditions. And so as you get streams that run through pastures that have no shading over them and their bottom is all all muddy, then those are going to be your streams that are pretty warm. And that warmth, the lower the temperature, the more oxygen the water can hold. It's kind of counterintuitive, but so the lower temperature, you get higher oxygen. And so with our water sample, what we are going to do is some chemistry testing. And so we look at nitrates and phosphates, which nitrates and phosphates are usually fertilizers that the farmers will put on their field and sometimes run off into the field if you don't have an appropriate buffer. We like nitrates and phosphates when they're on the land because they are plant food. But when they get into the water, they can cause issues such as overgrowth of algae and other plants, which shades the bottom and can cause issues with normal aquatic plant growth. But also, as the algae dies and the bacteria break them down, those bacteria are pulling oxygen out of the water. So again, it comes back to lowering the dissolved oxygen for the other organisms. In addition to streamside dissolved oxygen, we also want to measure a flow rate, because a nitrate level from one small stream contributes less nitrates overall than the same nitrate level of a large stream, because there's more water moving down through there. So things that we'll do is measure the width of the stream, and here again we always go at the same, we do the upstream and the downstream, and then we take an average of those. We also measured the depth. We measured depth at 5 places across the stream. That just gives us a general picture of what the stream bottom does across. So for example, if I was taking a stream, so I line up with my flags, and you want to make sure when you do this that you don't have it against the flow, because you can see this side is much lower than this side, so you want it to where both sides are equal. And then you can just get an approximate stream depth, like here is 19.5 centimeters. And we would just do that 5 places across upstream and 5 places across downstream. And so by measuring the width and the depth, that gives us a cross section, basically like a triangle that represents the upstream and downstream area of the stream. And then we have 10 meters marked across, and so we use high-tech equipment, i.e. ping pong balls, and a net. So one person will stand at the downstream side, another person will be up at the upstream side, and a third person with a timer. And so you drop the ping pong ball upstream and you time how long it takes to get to the downstream. It's not perfect because the ball can get hung up in eddies and stuff like that, but it gives you an idea of how quickly the flow is moving. And so by knowing the meters per second that your water's moving and your average cross section of upstream and downstream, you can calculate cubic meters per second. And 1 cubic meter of water is 1,000 liters, which is like 250 gallons. So every second, so for example, Climbers Run usually runs around 0.5 meter per second, so like 125 gallons a second. And so if we had 5 milligrams of nitrates per liter times that 125 is 625 milligrams per second. And then if you go up and up and up, you can calculate how many tons of nitrates climbers run contributes per year to the overall load. I think we calculated that at 6.5, it's around 2,500 tons of nitrates per year that this site contributes. And that's usually around 5 to 6 milligrams per liter of nitrates, which is generally considered safe to drink by the EPA. So anything 10 or above is considered unsafe to drink, although there's more research being done that maybe even 10 is a little too high for that. But yeah, so then after that we would go back and do our chemistry testing. So that's basically everything that we do streamside.